Chapter 6 of J.S. Bach by Albert Schweitzer, translated by Ernest Newman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Craster. The Cantata and the Passion before Bach. In the history of the cantata, there are two questions to be considered, a liturgical one and a musical one. How did it come about that in the evangelical church service a sacred concert should be inserted between the reading of the gospel and the sermon, that is to say, precisely in the place where one would least expect a musical interruption of this kind? This is the liturgical question. The musical question is concerned with the evolution of the old purely vocal motet into the cantata of Bach's time, with its arias, recitatives, and rich instrumental accompaniment. In order to understand how the cantata won its place in the church service, we must begin at the new arrangement of worship in the Reformation epoch. Luther did not banish the Mass from the service, but retained it, cutting out only the offertorium, the essentially Catholic act of sacrifice, and substituting the sermon for it. This alteration did not in any way affect the musical structure of the church service, since the great choral portions of the Mass, the Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus with Benedictus and Agnus Dei, still figured in the Protestant worship in the same place as in the Catholic. It is true that they could be replaced by German hymns, the Kyrie by Kyrie Gott Vater Ewigkeit, the Gloria by Allein Gott in der Hope sei the Credo by Wir glauben all an einen Gott, the Sanctus by Luther's Jesaja dem Propheten das Gisach, the Agnus Dei by O Lamm Gottes unschuldig. But in the churches that had choirs this did not happen, since Luther himself had thought it desirable to retain the Latin choral song, at all events at first. In this he was partly influenced by the consideration that the Latin song would be a salutary exercise in that language for the young. From the time of Luther to that of Bach, these great musical pieces were common to both Protestant and Catholic services. The Protestant cantors composed masses exactly like the Catholics, and the mass movements of the Italian masters were performed in the Protestant churches without anyone thinking it strange. Collections of masses were published, in which both Protestant and Catholic composers were represented. Bach himself copied out a number of Italian church compositions. The copies have come down to us, not because they had no better way of employing his time, but because they were to be performed on Sundays at St. Thomas's Church. Thus the distinction between Protestant and Catholic church music, of which we hear so much, had not made its appearance at that epoch. The service, in the churches that followed the Lutheran observance, was accordingly constituted in this fashion: Introit, Kyrie, Gloria, Epistle, Gradual, Gospel, Credo, Nicene Creed, Sermon, Communion with Sanctus, Benedictus and Agnus Dei. This sequence was in the main observed everywhere, however much the arrangements of the service, for Luther had thought the time was unripe for imposing a definitive uniformity on it, might deviate in detail. The Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, Benedictus and Agnus Dei were always the same for every Sunday. The Introit and the Gradual, however, changed each week, since the words of these had to be appropriate to each particular Sunday. The Offertorium, which again has to be in keeping with the day, had fallen into disuse and been supplanted by the German sermon. What was inevitable under the circumstances now happened. The German hymns, in keeping with the German sermon, aimed at expressing the character of each Sunday. In the Introit, that Latin antiphonal song between the priest and the choir, the hymns could find no place of entry. In the Gradual, however, between the Epistle and the Gospel, where from the earliest time the verses of a German hymn suited to the time of the year alternated with the Latin hymn, they could now be sung by the choir or by the congregation. How strong the tendency was to give the German hymns the imprint of the ecclesiastical season is shewn by the fact that in the course of the second half of the 16th century each Sunday had allotted to it once for all its 2 or 3 hymns. A hymn book published in 1566 is entitled Geistliche Lieder nach Ordnung der Jahreszeit ausgeteilt, spiritual songs distributed according to the order of the season. A still greater significance than that of these German gradual hymns, which led from the epistle into the gospel, became attached to the hymns which were inserted between the reading of the gospel and the credo on the one side and the sermon on the other. They naturally had the closest bearing on the gospel, and were thus especially in keeping with the particular Sunday. And since these hymns were given to the choir, the congregation singing between the gospel and the sermon, the hymn Wir glauben auch an einen Gott stood nothing in the way of writing more and more new hymns touching on the gospel for the day, for performance at this point. Thus by the side of the German sermon on the gospel for a given Sunday there sprang up a kind of parhelion in the form of a sermon in music. Whatever does not come within the range of its rays is lost in shadow. Musicians suddenly became conscious of a greater task before them than for ever writing fresh music to the statutory hymns of the Mass. There were new poems on the gospel to be set to music year by year. The effect of this freer church music on them was to make them practically indifferent to the statutory musical portion of the service. The same Kyrie or Gloria could be sung every Sunday, so long as the motets bearing on the sermon were new and expressive. So it came about that even in the churches where the art had its due place, the Mass was given wholly in figurate music only in rare cases, on high feast days. Ordinarily they were satisfied with musicizing the Kyrie and the Gloria. The remainder was indeed retained in the service, but was musically starved, the whole strength of the artistic feeling being poured into the sermon motets. Thus the Protestant artists turned away from the old God to serve the new one, who was more interesting and promised them more reward. They took more pleasure in composing new motet texts than in turning into tone again and again, with deadly contempt, the woeful, unmusical Nicene Creed. They would rather write a whole year's sermon music than one complete Mass. Bach, in fact, composed 5 yearly series and only one complete Mass. And when he needed the music for a Mass, he borrowed it from the Italians or from his own cantatas. He did not borrow his cantatas from other composers, although as a matter of fact he could just as well have made use of material of this kind as of the Mass fragments that he borrowed. He preferred to compose his own cantatas, which was new and therefore always interesting work, and to borrow the Mass movements that he needed, for the composition of Latin texts had little interest for him. In this he was only following the instinct of Protestant church music since the middle of the 16th century. The first important cycle of gospel settings appeared in 1542. It was Martin Agricola's Sangbüchlein aller Sonntagsevangelien, eine kurze deutsche Segenmusik mitsamt den Evangelien durchs ganze Jahr auf alle Sonntage. Afterwards, Nikolaus Hermann and Homerus Herpol did valuable work in this field. Texts were provided by the preachers Bartholomäus Ringwald and Johann Hermann, the poet of O Gott, du fromme Gott, and Herzliebster Jesu, was hast du verbrochen? The latter entitled his works Andachtige Kirchsäufer oder evangelische Schleichsglocklein in den Schaft und Kern aller gewöhnlichen Sonntags und vornehmsten Festevangelien Reimweis gegossen und damit seine Predigten beschlossen hat Johannes Hermann. This ecclesiastical art was free, bound by no tradition and cramped by no convention. The task it had set itself of expounding the gospel in music was so great and so admirable that all the progress in music the whole world over seemed appointed only to bring German evangelical music nearer to its goal. So Protestant music from the beginning of the 17th century to that of the 18th consciously and deliberately gave itself up to all the influences of both religious and secular music, from whatever source, without shrinking from or fearing anything new, animated only by a holy impulse to creation. The Landgrave Moritz of Hesse Castle might have been moved by a singular presentiment when he came to Marburg in 1609 to urge his former chapel boy, now a law student, Heinrich Schütz, to go to Venice with a stipend of 100 thalers for 2 years to study with the masters living there. In the person of this youth, German art itself crossed the Alps. Instead of 2 years, he remained 4. His teacher was Giovanni Gabrieli, who had such an affection for him that on his dying bed he bequeathed a ring to him. Gabrieli died in 1613. Schütz accompanied him to the grave before returning home. His other teacher was Monteverdi, the creator of the old Italian opera, by whose instruction he benefited again in 1628 when he spent another year in Venice. These two masters between them gave German art, which was now sitting at their feet in the person of Schütz, just what it needed for its renaissance. For Giovanni Gabrieli, from Giovanni Gabrieli, it learned a new polyphony. While Germany was still under the influence of the animated but slender counterpoint of the Netherlands school, and lacked the power to develop it further unaided, the three great Venetian masters, Andrea Gabrieli, 1510 to 1586, his nephew Giovanni Gabrieli, 1557 to 1613, and Claudio Merullo, 1532 to 1604, had evolved a style which was at once bolder and more singable than that of the northern school. The polyphony is transfigured by its melodic quality. Each separate voice really sings, is a musical personality. The new style was developed simultaneously in organ music and choral music. At the same time, instrumental music entered upon a quite new stage. It began to be independent. Giovanni Gabrieli not only used his small orchestra to support the choir, but gave it short, independent preludes to play. The gift of Monteverdi, the first great opera composer, to German art was even more precious. He implanted the dramatic sense in it. This oldest Italian opera must be absolved from the censure that Wagner pronounced upon the later one. It was not a loose collection of arias, but really what it claimed to be, a drama per musica. Monteverdi, of all composers, perhaps had the closest affinity with Wagner. There is some truth in Guido Adler's remark that the creator of the Ring should really be regarded as a representative of the Renaissance, and more particularly of the Renaissance opera. The creators of the stilo rappresentativo, as the new kind of music was called, had the same ideals as Wagner. For them, as for him, music was not an end in itself, but served only to express the drama, and it was their desire that the orchestra should be invisible. Their melody, however, took the form of dramatic declamation, the inherent expressiveness of which can still move the modern hearer most profoundly. Monteverdi's Lament of Ariadne, Lamento d'Arianna, may be cited as an example. This mighty Renaissance art made its entry through Schütz into the German church. We can scarcely realize the enthusiasm with which it was greeted on this side of the Alps. What questions and answers there must have been when Schütz and Michael Pretorius, who, without having himself studied in Italy, looked to that country for the regeneration of German art, met in Dresden in the latter part of the summer of 1614, where they had to provide the music for a christening in the family of the Electoral Prince. It was Schütz's destiny during years of restless wandering to carry the new art from court to court, even as far as Copenhagen. It is true that in 1617 he was appointed Kapellmeister to the Electoral Prince at Dresden, which post he occupied for 55 years until his death. But from the beginning of the 30s the Kapelle existed mostly only in name, the miseries of the 30 Years' War having compelled the court to retrench to the utmost. In 1639 the number of the musicians had fallen from 36 to 10. Salaries were paid when there happened to be any money. In the meanwhile, Schütz and his subordinates had to shift as best they could. More than once we find him resident for a considerable time at the court of Copenhagen in the service of the Danish crown prince, the son-in-law of the Electoral Prince of Saxony. Other princely courts also offered him temporary shelter. It was in these sad times that he wrote his finest works, for which, however, it was often years before he could find an engraver. Probably much of it that only existed in manuscript has been lost to us. We owe the preservation of the 7 last words to the Castle Library. Other works were preserved at Wolfenbüttel. Even when the war was over, and should settle down again definitively in Dresden, he could not succeed in reorganizing the Kapelle. All the personal sacrifices he had made, in order to keep together through the period of misery at least a nucleus of young musicians in expectation of a better time, seem to have been in vain. When the new Electoral Prince George II, who took a greater interest in music than his father had done, came to the throne in 1656, the Italians whom he favored threw the old man of 70 into the shade. In deep dejection, he cursed the day when he devoted himself to music and entered the service of princes. He would willingly have gone to some other large art-loving town, he thought, indeed of Hamburg, if the distress of the prince's musicians and the infirmities of age had not retained him in Dresden. But the art that he cursed, as Jeremiah did his prophetic calling, sustained him. The old man wrote 4 great biblical histories: a Christmas history, 1664, which has been almost entirely lost; a St. John Passion, 1665; a St. Matthew Passion, 1666, and a St. Luke Passion. He passed away gently in the afternoon of the 6th November, 1673, during the singing of the friends who surrounded his couch. His pupil Christoph Bernhard, cantor at St. Jacobi's in Hamburg, had, at his request, his own strength being insufficient for the work, sent him his funeral text, the passage from the Psalms, Deine Rechte sind mein Leid in meinem Haus, arranged as a 5-part motet, for which Schütz had thanked him. To our surprise, we do not find among Schütz's works just what we should have most expected to find: complete yearly series of compositions on the Gospels for each Sunday. If he did not write any of it was because the only kind of text which, as an Italian of the new school, he could use for this kind of work did not appear in Germany until he was an old man. The texts for the gospel music were strophic hymns, and were in no way distinguishable from the texts of the congregational hymns. The only way they could be composed was as sacred songs, or motets with a chorale-like cantus firmus. Italian music, on the other hand, demanded a poem of much freer construction, the madrigal. The music of a Monteverdi had been a rebirth from musical declamation. Being in essence the negation of song, it could not employ any song text that was compressed into an artificial or monotonous verse metre. What it demanded was a free rhymed prose, in which rhyme and metre existed only as servants of the music. With this aversion to rhyming lines of the same strength that broke up the musical tissue in an obviously unnatural way, music entered the path that was to lead it, after a couple of centuries of wandering, to the style of Wagner. A fundamental problem now presents itself which, in the last resort, runs through the whole history of music. If the opera begins to decline immediately after Monteverdi, ultimately to degenerate into a loosely knit, undramatic string of arias, the fault lay not with music but with poetry, which offered it neither an adequate matter nor an adequate form, but went on its own way, merely dropping now and then something towards which the languishing art could stoop, as St. Peter did towards the cherries. The history of sacred music until Bach is likewise exclusively a history of the musical texts, and so it forms the true pendant to the history of the opera, which is equivalent to saying that the history is a tragic one. The madrigal, says Caspar Ziegler, in his treatise of 1653 upon this text form, is a short epigrammatic poem in which the culminating effect, conclusion, resides in the last 2 rhymes or even in the last line alone. The preceding lines may be of any number, and each may be just as long as the poet likes to make it, but usually of 7 or 11 syllables, some rhymed, some unrhymed. A madrigal must not be constrained in form. It will often be more like ordinary speech than a poem. I must, however, mention in conclusion that no single genus carminis in the German tongue suits music better than a madrigal, for the union of the two gives the best possible results. And since the words can be set so finely in their natural construction, the harmony also is so much better and more agreeable. According to Ziegler, these madrigals were sung in the stilo recitativo. When a great many of them are strung together, it is desirable, he thinks, to let an arietta or an aria of several stanzas run between, so as to get the needful variety. With Ziegler, however, recitative does not mean the bare recitativo secco of the later Italian opera or of the Bach passions, but the dramatic melodic recitative of Monteverdi, resembling our Arioso. In the same way his arietta or aria is far removed from the later formal da capo aria, also used by Bach. It denotes simply a melodic piece of a more pronounced song-like structure than the Arioso. Thus for Caspar Ziegler the ideal text is one that permits the musician to pass by means of a continuous, affectful, passionate, as the term then was, declamation from melodic recitative to pure melody and back again. He thus lays down the whole ideal of declamatory music. There was lacking only the poet to realize the ideal and to give the musicians texts of this kind for their gospel music. In that critical moment, however, German literature was not sufficiently advanced, and later, when it perhaps might have found it possible, music and poetry had drifted so far away from each other that each had lost sight of the ideal of cooperation. How admirably suited the madrigal style is to music may be seen from Bach's St. Matthew Passion. The texts of the ariosos that precede the great arias are in the madrigal manner. They consist of a succession of freely arranged verses which are only preliminaries leading up to the ultimate conclusion. For example, Mein Jesus schweigt zu falschen Lügenstile, uns damit zu zeigen, dass sein erbarmungsvoller Wille für uns zum Leiden sei geneigt, und dass wir in der gleichen Pein ihm sollen anlich sein, und in Verfolgung stille schweigen. Or again, hat uns allen wohlgetan, den Blinden gab das Gesicht, die Lahmen macht gehend, sagt uns seins Vaters Wort, trieb die Teufel fort, Betrübte hat aufgericht, nahm die Sünder auf und an, sonst hat mein Jesus nicht getan. These are the attempts at a musical poetic style that we meet with here and there in Bach's work. But where else has the master's art such freedom of speech? Where else is it so incomparable? The most characteristic German madrigal of the 17th century is the Hirtenlust of the poet-musician Johann Hermann Schein, a friend of Schutz's. This work appeared in 1624. Curiously enough, Ziegler does not mention it, although it represents the ideal of the declamatory song for which he is pleading. Schein also left a collection of sacred madrigals with the title Israel's Brunlein, 1623. Schutz received Ziegler's treatise immediately after its publication, and he sent a friendly letter to the author, who was a relation of his. In this he heartily wishes him, in the name of music, good luck in his exertions for the German madrigal. The German composers, he says, who until now have repeatedly tried to set to music in good style the beautiful inventions of the new poetry of today, have yet always lamented that the genus poesios, which best suits the making of a skilful composition, namely the madrigal, has hitherto not been seized upon by them, but neglected. Schutz thus did not feel himself to be in a position to devote himself to the strophic form of text. With him begins the estrangement between the art song and the chorale, which hitherto had been harmoniously united in the chorale motet. For Schutz, in contrast with the composers of his time, the harmonization of the chorale has no interest whatever. Nor was he greatly concerned about congregational singing. It is quite a mistake to intersperse his passions, when we perform them nowadays, with chorale verses, or even with congregational hymns. Schutz himself never thought of doing so. In the course of time this estrangement developed into a bitter war. Mattheson, the famous Hamburg contemporary of Bach, wears his pen to the stump, in proving again and again that the true church music must get rid of the chorale in particular, and the strophic song in general, since the strophe interrupts the musical development, and in general is to be regarded as the maladie de la mélodie, the French play upon words being Mattheson's own. The problem, then, that gave such trouble to all the composers of German music before Bach, and indeed to him as well, already faced Schutz in its acutest form. The new music cannot work with the old style strophic songs upon the Gospels, for these are quite undramatic. On the other hand, the poetry of the time is unable to give music the dramatic texts in madrigal form into which it could throw itself and gratify its newborn dramatic instincts. The dramatic musical representation of the gospel for the day remained an ideal of the future, which Bach and his contemporaries tried to realize in their cantatas. Schütz, therefore, disregarding the gospel cycle and contemporary gospel poems, has direct recourse to the Bible itself, plunging into its treasures in the hope of finding the dramatic texts which he cannot get from the poetasters of his time. He composes psalms, detached verses from the Bible, whole dramatic fragments. Where the Bible does not of itself provide him with something musically dramatic, he makes it by arranging the finest passages in dialogue form. The Pharisee and the publican go into the temple. A prophet exhorts his people. King David laments over his son Absalom. Above the prostrate Paul is heard the voice calling from above, until the questions die away in the sky. The Saviour on the cross speaks the 7 last words. Where is there, indeed, such a German requiem as the funerary music woven by Schütz out of biblical texts and songs? Thus his texts have escaped the doom that has overtaken the poetry of his time. The music is not, as with Bach, to cover with its own splendor the nakedness of the words. Here it is only the artistic setting that brings out more fully the brilliance of the precious tones of the text. If Schütz, in so far as he goes back for his texts almost exclusively to the words of the Bible, is anything but an innovator, on the other hand, from the musical point of view, he must really be regarded as a revolutionary. In German church music, Gabrieli's manner of employing several choruses in order to get massive dramatic effects was a revolution, upon which Schütz discourses in the preface to his Psalmen Davids, 1619. So too was the independent employment of the orchestra in the works Schütz wrote after his second Italian sojourn, where he became acquainted with Monteverdi's music. Another revolution was the introduction of recitative-like solo songs. In order to grasp the significance of this innovation, we must realize that hitherto, in Protestant church music, the biblical words had always been rendered by a single voice in the psalmody, or as it was then called, the collect tone, that is, the monotonous recitation, not yet divided into bars, which had been customary in the Catholic Church, and which Luther and Walther had taken over for their own church service with a few trifling modifications. It was in this old style that the evangelist still recited in the Historie von der fröhlichen und siegreichen Auferstehung of 1623. But from the moment when Schütz became acquainted with Monteverdi's recitative-like arioso, he employs this, and does not shrink from setting in this manner even the 7 words of Jesus on the cross. All this is revolutionary. In the last resort, however, it is merely the visible expression of the essentially revolutionary thing in Schütz's art, the ideal he had set himself of making music characteristic and pathetic. He may renounce choral effects, instrumental accompaniment, even dramatic recitative, as he does in his last works, the Passions, where the choir sings unaccompanied and the story of the Passion is recited to the collect tone, but his art remains the same. The new form, startling as it is, and great as was the transformation it wrought, is only the servant of the new spirit. And Schütz's art is primitive art, but of such a kind that it cannot be surpassed by any later art, precisely because it is not form, best spirit. As we find it hard to part from the first spring days, and pass into the season of fully unfolding and ripening, so we tear ourselves almost regretfully away from this primitive art, with its buds full of the coming wealth of ideas and forms, in order to see what ultimately became of it. In art, as in everything else, is not all unfolding and ripening a kind of withering, since in the full bloom we no longer have truth and reality appealing to us with that mysterious directness that is more magically eloquent than even perfection itself. For primitive art of this kind, the later product, perfect though it be, is not a heightening of something less perfect, but merely the revelation of all that was latent in the primitive organism. Bach did not know Schütz's music, or if he did not greatly value it. He copied out the works of all kinds of previous and contemporary masters. Of Schütz not a line has come down to us in Bach's handwriting. As Spitta says, Schütz's relation to him can only be conceived as an ideal one. He does not stand on Schütz's shoulders, but is unconsciously nourished by his work, just as in nature a new vegetation draws its sustenance from the invisible but still active forces of its buried predecessor. With Schütz, concert music made its way into the church and transformed the motet into the cantata. The new form is met with under various names. It is called indifferently motetta, concerto, sinfonia, or dialogue. The term cantata, in the usual meaning of the word, does not come till later. Even in Bach's time this term was almost exclusively employed to designate the sole cantata. He himself entitles one of his first cantatas the Ratswechsel, cantata for Mühlhausen, 1708, number 71, a motetta. In the church ordinances, the place for the performance of the cantata is indicated simply by the words Hernach wird Musiziert, here follows music. But if the name varies, the fact is indisputable. In place of the sermon motet, it was now permissible to perform choral works with soli and orchestra. This innovation had come about without a single voice being raised in opposition. This was possible because it was an epoch of living ideals. In the German towns of that time, large and small, we find ideals such as have animated no other citizen communities since the time of the ancient Greeks. Fatal as it was from the political standpoint that religion had become an affair of states and communes, yet by this very means those ancient conditions were renewed in which the citizen community regarded it as its highest civic duty to look to the artistic form of its own religious service. The service is the concern not of the church but of the town. It is not the consistory that engages the cantor and appoints the singers and the instrumentalists for the church, but the town council and the citizens. The reputation and the credit of the town are involved in having an artistic cultus. When Christoph Bernhard, Schütz's favorite pupil, went to Hamburg in 1663 to be cantor and musical director at the Johanneum, the leading people of the town, so Mattheson tells us, went as far as Bergedorf to meet him with 6 coaches, a distance of 2 miles. Johann Rudolf Ahler, 1625 to 1673, was both cantor and burgomeister at Mühlhausen in Thuringia. The town musicians were chiefly intended to assist in the church music. The educational institutions of the town had also to lend their aid to the art. The Latin schools furnished the choirs. Every boy with a good voice entered the school, and was maintained by the town during the whole period of his education. If he lost his voice at puberty, he had meanwhile learned an instrument and could now play in the orchestra. If he had any artistic talent, he could safely continue his studies at the university with the certainty of being able to live by his art. Telemann, the Hamburg master, secured an important position for himself in Leipzig even when a student. One result of this close connection between the educational system and music was that the level of culture among the musicians of that time was higher than it has ever been since. If we examine the careers of the artists of that time, we see that almost all of them decided to take up music during or after their university course. German jurisprudence may be proud of having provided almost all the best musicians of the 17th century and the early part of the 18th. It can claim Schütz, Walter, Mattheson, Handel, Kuhnau, Emanuel Bach, and many other distinguished names. Whether a composer necessario must have studied is a question put by one Johann Behrens in an essay published in 1719. He answered it with a decisive affirmative. The real quality of their culture is seen when we examine their literary productions, from the Syntagma Musicum of Michael Praetorius to the works of Emanuel Bach, Gerber, Adlung, Marburg, and the rest. On the other hand, this close connection between art and education resulted in every educated person having some knowledge of music, and those who owed their schooling to it remained true to it, to whatever position of dignity they rose. This general diffusion of artistic culture explains the interest, quite incomprehensible from the standpoint of the present day, that was taken in the music of the church. To the Protestant towns of that time, the artistic church service was what the theatre was to the Greek community, the centre of art and religion. For the rulers, again, great and small, the religious service was a concern of state. Many of them, indeed, when they were looking out for a good Kapellmeister or cantor, disregarded the injunction as to unyoking, extorting, or alienating, as Luther puts it in his explanation of the 10th commandment, and did anything but admonish the person on whom they had cast covetous eyes to remain where he was and do his duty. A good musician in those days had his value as a political commodity. The desire to stand well with the Elector of Saxony was certainly not the least consideration that induced the Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel to yield to the continual solicitations of Johann George of Saxony and let him have the young Schütz. The misery of the 30 Years' War broke up many of these unions of souls. The princes who had fostered art in obedience to an ideal made the greatest sacrifices and did all they possibly could to make the service the last to feel the retrenchments necessitated by the events of the time. The Prince of Liegnitz was one of them. Johann George of Saxony, however, who had ostentatiously carried his capella about with him everywhere, practiced his first economies in connection with his musicians. Unfortunately, it is for the most part only in account papers, yellow with age, and the dreary protocols of town councils, that we can read the story of the efforts made by the German communities of that epoch for religious music, and most of the documents still slumber in the archives. It thus happens that we have more information upon the material side of the case than upon the artistic. From the transactions of the Mulhausen Society we may learn all that happened at the annual banquet of Convivium Musicale, which was served at table, and what it cost. From the council records one would think that this formal, solid feasting was the main feature of the affair. Surveying the situation as a whole, we must acknowledge that the conditions were singularly favorable for the coming of great church music. Yet this epoch created nothing great and durable. Not that it was lacking in creative force or the joy of creation. Never was so much music composed as then. Every cantor made it his pride to supply a cantata of his own for each Sunday and feast day. No one was looked upon as a musician unless he could compose. Men of the most mediocre talent had a complete mastery of the technique of composition. They laid the foundation of it by copying out voice parts, and afterwards a thorough practical education made them capable of producing serviceable music at quite an early age. The system of instruction in that epoch cannot at all be compared with ours, which is almost wholly directed to making performers. It was at once more practical and had a far loftier ideal. From the standpoint of education, printed music is a Danaeus gift, since it enables students to escape the elementary instruction given by copying music. Although the conditions were so favorable, that epoch created nothing durable. Imagine what a corresponding epoch would have produced in painting under similar circumstances. In music we have merely names deserving of reverence and respect, but not immortal works. And even if all the cantatas of that time that are still sleeping in sacristies and church vaults awaiting their discoverer should be brought into the light of day, we should be no richer in really great art. The way from Schütz to Bach goes over hills, not over mountains. The problem of the text is still unsolved. To some extent the form of the strophic song holds its ground. Some composers experiment with the madrigal form, others go back to the Bible and the old church hymn, but no definitive form is evolved. The most important representative of the transitional cantata is Andreas Hammerschmidt, 1611 to 1675, organist of St. John's Church in Zittau, whose Musikalische Andachten and Musikalische Gespräche were universally admired. Johann Rudolf Ahler, 1625 to 1673, of Mulhausen, and Wolfgang Karl Bruegel, 1626 to 1712, of Darmstadt, were also held in high esteem. In comparison with Schütz, their music may be called almost conservative. The art of Johann Christoph Bach, the court and town organist at Eisenach, (1642 to 1703), is much bolder. Johann Sebastian, his nephew, thought a great deal of him, and produced his Michaelmas cantata Es erhob sich ein Streit in Leipzig. This has come down to us. The work of the uncle foreshadows the art of the nephew. The cantata is written in 22 real parts and contains some astonishing harmonic audacities. Johann Christoph's mastery of polyphony was so great that he never played on the organ or the clavier in fewer than 5 real parts. Philipp Emanuel Bach inherited from his father, along with the copies of his great uncle's works, his father's admiration for him. When Forkel, the first biographer of Bach, visited Philipp Emanuel in Hamburg, the latter played him some of the compositions of his ancestor. I still have a very lively recollection, writes the biographer later, how pleasantly the old man smiled at me during the most remarkable and boldest passages, when he gave me the pleasure of letting me hear some of these old works in Hamburg. Johann Michael, the brother of Johann Christoph, organist and town clerk of Geren, was less important. Nevertheless, Johann Sebastian copied out several of his motets, one of which was for a long time erroneously regarded as his own work. In the north, where the church music at first did not ally itself with contemporary poetry, it mostly followed the lines of Schütz, deriving its texts simply from the Bible and the hymn books, and throwing the whole weight of the dramatic expression upon the music alone. As the North had suffered least during the 30 Years' War, it was able to do much more for art than was possible elsewhere. Nuremberg in the South ceased to be an artistic center. For the next 2 generations, Dresden and Leipzig allowed Hamburg and Lübeck to take the lead of them. Hamburg in particular was regarded as the land of promise for musicians. The old Schütz would have liked to settle there. When Bach was looking round for a definitive post, he set his hopes on Hamburg, and it is practically by an accident that he did not go there. If indeed we can call by that term what was really the successful intrigue of a mediocrity, backed by money, against a man of ability. In Hamburg we find the 2 most important pupils of Schütz, Matthias Weckmann (1621 to 1674) and Christoph Bernhard (1627 to 1692). In Lübeck was Franz Tunder (1614 to 1667), a pupil of Frescobaldi, and the predecessor of Buxtehude, who, in accordance with the custom of the time, married the organist's office in the person of the daughter of its previous occupier. His successor, Schieferdecker, did the same thing. When and how the celebrated Abendmusiken, evening performances of music, originated in the Lübeck Marienkirche seems to be no longer ascertainable with certainty. Mention is first made of them in the protocol book of the Marienkirche for 1673, according to which any one who henceforth shall be appointed and engaged as musician to the council must assist at the organ at the 5 Abendmusiken gratis. The organist himself had to pay the assistant musicians whom he engaged out of the musicians' guild. For this he received his douceur from the leading citizens. In Buxtehude's time it was customary for the organist to present to the high patrons the printed textbooks of the Abendmusiken, as we learn from a copy inscribed by him in 1700 to a certain Herr Dietrich Wolfrath. If the collection did not cover the expenses, the town council helped. It also looked after the maintenance of order. At the performance in commemoration of the Emperor Leopold I on 2nd December 1705, Bach was staying in Lübeck at the time and was present. The pressure of the crowd was so great that 2 corporals and 18 privates were necessary. As a rule, the council house guard sufficed. When the Lübeck cantor Roetz, a contemporary of Bach, enquired in 1753 among the old people how the Abendmusiken were begun, he was told that in old times the organist at St. Mary's used to play something on the organ for the citizens before they went to the Bourse, and that the Abendmusiken developed gradually out of these performances. This conjecture, which has been repeated in all the histories of music, flattering as it is for the old Lübeck speculators, has no claim to authenticity. It does not explain why the performances took place on Sunday and in the cold season of the year. The music was given, that is, between 4 and 5 o'clock on the Sundays between Martinmas and Christmas, at the conclusion of the afternoon service, with the exception of the first Sunday in Advent. Thus 5 concerts were given each season. It is much more probable that the performances originated in an Advent festival, although it must be set against this view that, in conformity with the gospel selection in the old church, which dealt with the last judgment, Advent was regarded as a time of penitence and mourning, during which all music, even the organ, had to cease. In Leipzig and most other places no cantatas were given on these Sundays. The 5 cantatas constituted a single whole. The titles have come down to us of 3 cycles of the kind composed by Buxtehude. One was called The Wedding of the Lamb, the second Heavenly Delight of the Soul, Upon the Earth, over the birth of our Saviour Jesus Christ and his becoming man, the third, the most terrible and most joyful of all things, namely the end of time and the beginning of eternity, exhibited in dialogue. All 3 titles indicate Advent. Unhappily, both text and music are lost. While Steele, in 1885, was writing upon Tunder in Eitner's Monatshefte für Musikgeschichte, and in the following year upon the organist of the Marienkirche, he lamented the fact that we possess hardly any of the choral works of the northern masters of that time, those of Lübeck or those of Hamburg, except some 20 church cantatas of Buxtehude. But when travelling in Sweden in 1889, he discovered that the famous library at Upsala had preserved a great number of these church compositions. It possesses the musical collection of the Duben family, in which at that time the office of Hofkapellmeister at Stockholm had been hereditary for 3 generations, up to Carl Gustav Duben, who occupied it from 1719. The Dubens kept up a brisk correspondence with the 2 North German musical centres, often visited their friends among the composers, and copied out whatever particularly pleased them. From their cantatas we first learn what Tunder, Weckmann and Bernhardt could do. Buxtehude also we now know better. One feature that is common to all of them is the frequently brilliant treatment of the orchestra. They aim at color effects, especially Weckmann and Buxtehude. The latter employs in the cantata Ihr lieben Christen freut euch 3 violins, 3 violas, 3 cornets, 3 trombones, 2 trumpets, bassoon, contrabass and organ. Continuo. The wind predominate and are combined with the organ in all kinds of ways. A composition of the year 1697 for the consecration of the new altar at the Marienkirche requires 3 choruses, kettle drums and trumpets. Tunder is almost more important than Buxtehude. His cantata on Eine feste Burg is a powerful and spirited work. Already, however, the influence of the instrumental style on vocal works begins to be visible. We feel that we are coming to the epoch when the pure vocal style is no longer the concern of any German composer. With Weckmann we often fancy we are reading Bach, so instrumental is his writing for the voices. At the same time we must not form an exaggerated idea of the means that these instrumentally minded composers had at their disposal. At Lübeck difficulties arose from the character of the church. Under the most favourable circumstances, Buxtehude could accommodate 40 choristers on the 6 rows of seats running by the side of the great organ. Since it was hardly possible for him to get each voice doubled, the chorus, according to our views, must have been completely smothered by the instrumental mass. In Hamburg it was no better. The cantor at St. Peter's, for example, had at his disposal in 1730 7 singers, against whom there were 17 instrumentalists, without counting the 3 trumpets and the kettle drum. In their method of employing the chorale, these composers hark back to the epoch before Schütz. It plays a great part in their works, whereas he had been disposed to put it aside. They write whole cantatas upon chorales, and so create the type of the chorale cantata, which later on alternately attracts and repels Bach again and again. Strictly speaking, this form of cantata is a mere medley, since a strophic song is not in place in the text of a work with solo pieces. The whole species invites the criticism that a new patch does not suit an old garment. But the chorale is put to marvelous uses in the cantatas constructed out of passages from the Bible. Buxtehude's texts are often quite impressive in their harmony of biblical passages and chorale strophes, especially when the chorale threads its way through the whole like a central idea. The symbolism of the wordless, purely instrumental chorale melody, with which Bach was afterwards to express his deepest thoughts, is also already perfected. Thus the problem of the text seems to be settled at last. Contemporary poetry abandons the attempt to create a free form, and the musician constructs the cantata for himself out of verses from the Bible and strophes from the hymn books, which he contrasts with each other or builds up in a dramatic sequence. One could wish that the artists of that time had realized that this was the only solution, that the treasures of the Bible and of the German hymn books were inexhaustible, and will last out as long as music and the world themselves, and that music therefore had everything it needed within its own hands, and had no need of poets for its texts. But just at this moment there springs up again the antique ideal of the cooperation of poetry and music in a dramatic representation of religious ideas. It bewitches Protestant church music, luring it onward with the charm of a great ideal, helped by the insufficiency of the German poetry of the time, and the course of music became an uncertain wandering. The fatal thing is that Bach, as a child of his time, had to take part in this wandering, and kept groping after the true form of the cantata his whole life long. Inspired by the idea of the religious drama, the poorest poetry was blind to its own incompetence. The new cantata differs from the old both textually and musically. Textually, for the most part, in that it dispenses with Bible passages and chorale verses, and trusts entirely to free poetry. This free text, however, is laid out on the plan of the contemporary Italian opera, which has nothing in common with Monteverdi's music drama, but consists of da capo arias and recitatives that come near to speech. In this new art, which is under the Neapolitan influence, the melodic and the declamatory are no longer blended as they were in Monteverdi's Arioso, but separate into unmelodic recitative and undeclamatory song. Nothing is left of that strong musical dramatic feeling that we find in the drama per musica of the Renaissance. The dramatic is now wholly transformed into the reflective, that is, into the aria. As this has no longer to consist of music that conforms with the action, it becomes purely formal, while the recitative, the carrier of the action, renounces all melodic form. Thus the new recitative and the new aria only resulted from the inability of the operatic art of that time to create real dramatic music. As soon as a mind appears that can conceive and express music and action in one artistic idea, it revolts against this divorce of song and declamation. This was the case with Gluck and with Wagner, who both, like Monteverdi, had in view the true drama per musica. At the end of the 18th century, however, the two new forms that had sprung out of the decline of the Italian musical stage were received with royal honors by the German composers of evangelical church music. Anyone who did not welcome them was regarded as a scorner of the true musical gospel. They pushed choral music into the background, and church music came to consist almost exclusively of solo songs. At this time the Passion music, which hitherto had gone on its way unmolested, also became embroiled in the Revolution. Henceforward its venerable antiquity was to be no protection against innovation. Till then it had really had no history. As far back as the 4th century, according to tradition, the story of the Passion, according to St. Matthew, was recited on Palm Sunday, and that, according to St. Luke, on the Wednesday of Passion Week. In the 8th and 9th centuries, the Passion, according to St. Mark, was allotted to Tuesday in the Holy Week, and the Passion, according to St. John, to Good Friday. Already in the 13th century, Durandus desires the recital to be in dramatic form. Only the words of the evangelist are to be delivered in the gospel tone, that is, as psalmody, while the gentle words of Jesus and the cries of the unbelieving people are to be rendered characteristically. The psalmody method of delivery lasts until the end of the 15th century. The Passion is recited like every other passage from the Gospel. At the beginning of the 16th century, the composers of the Netherlands undertake for the first time to set the story of the Passion to music. The first musical Passion is by Jacobus Obrecht, born 1450, and dates from 1505. Luther's friend Johann Walther copied it out twice. When it was published by George Rowe in 1538, Melanchthon contributed a preface to it. In the epoch that followed, Passion music was written by both Catholic and Protestant composers, as in the case of the various portions of the Mass, nor is any distinction made between German and Latin Passions. The numerous Passions of that time fall, according to their form, into two groups: motet Passions and dramatic Passions. In the former, the whole text, including the words of Jesus, is rendered by the choir. In the latter, the words of the evangelist and the speeches of Jesus are recited by one person in the old gospel tone, and only the cries of the people are set polyphonically through, though the chorus renders also the words of Pilate, of the false witnesses, and of the malefactors. The dramatic Passion naturally triumphed over the undramatic motet Passion. The St. Matthew Passion of Johann Walther is the first German composition in this style. According to tradition, it was performed on Palm Sunday in 1530. His St. John Passion, which was given on Good Friday, has survived to our day. It was sung yearly in Zittau from 1609 to 1816 in a Czech translation. Schütz retains the dramatic Passion as he had received it. He dispenses with instrumental means of every kind, making the evangelist psalmodize in the old collect tone, and makes no use in the Passions of the declamatory arioso that he elsewhere employs for the solo renderings of Bible passages. No aria, no chorale interrupts the action. The severe beauty of this old Passion form, transfigured by Schütz's art, is unique of its kind. It reminds us of the affecting representations of the Passion by the realistic painters of the Netherlands. Its profound effect when the singers take the part of the evangelist knows how to enter into the old style, can almost make us believe that we are listening to one of Bach's Passions. The lack of the pathetic and the contemplative, however, necessarily discredited the old dramatic Passion, and the older church music in general, in an epoch that took rhetorical reflection for the essence of drama. The new movement begins with the founding of the Hamburg Opera, when in 1678 Gerhard Schott, the licentiate Lucians, and the organist Reinken cooperated in the building of a theatre. They had in their minds not so much a secular as a religious opera. Thiele's Adam und Eva was the first opera, Singspiel, to be given on the stage. Then came Michael und David, 1679. Die Makkabäische Mutter und ihre sieben Söhne, 1679. Esther, 1680. Christi Geburt, 1681. And Kain und Abel oder der Verweifelte Brudermörder, 1682. It is, as a matter of fact, hard to find anything religious in the trivial and absurd texts of these operas. That age, however, thought otherwise. The clergy took a prominent part in supporting the undertaking. One clergyman, Heinrich Elmenhorst, wrote the texts of several Singspiele, and from the pulpit recommended the faithful to go to the opera. When, in course of time, the theatre had forfeited the good opinion of many serious-minded citizens by reason of the coarseness and tastelessness that had flaunted themselves on the stage, Elmenhorst, in his Dramatologia Antiqua Hodierna, tries to rehabilitate the institution. He argues that this theatre is simply the ancient Greek drama applied to Christian ends. As the Greeks represented on the stage for religious edification the stories of their gods and heroes, so it is a necessity to Christendom to see the biblical stories unfolded before the eye in animated action. The theological faculties of Rostock and Wittenberg, being consulted on the matter, declared themselves in principle for the religious opera. All this, however, could not arrest its decline. and in the course of time the religious drama disappeared from the stage. But the ideal that is upheld in Elmenhorst's work still lived and dominated the artistic life of Hamburg in the epoch, the most brilliant for Hamburg that followed when Kaiser, Mattheson, Handel and Telemann lived and worked there. Reinhard Kaiser came to Hamburg in 1694. Handel lived there from 1703 to 1705. Mattheson, a Hamburger by birth, belonged to the opera from childhood. His true work, however, did not begin until 1705, when he abandoned the career of singer and actor. Telemann was invited to Hamburg in 1721. What position these artists occupied, whether they held office in the theatre or in the church, mattered nothing, since they all wrote impartially for both church and opera. From 1715 to 1728, Mattheson was cantor of the cathedral, in which post he was able to do a good deal for the new church music. When his increasing deafness forced him to resign, Kaiser, who until then had officiated only at the opera, became his successor. Telemann had been called to Hamburg to be choir master and cantor at the Johanneum, but he was also engaged by the theatre to provide operas at a yearly salary of 300 thalers. Handel, who had gone to Hamburg mainly for the opera, also wrote music for the church. These composers gave up the effort to consider the Hamburg theatre, in accordance with the intentions of its founders, as primarily a home of religious art, and to maintain it on that level. But in exchange they tried to import the religious opera into the service church, not troubling themselves as to whether it had any appropriateness to the ecclesiastical season or to the gospel for the day. To what gospel are the theatrical soliloquies of Telemann appropriate, such as Der verhaufte Joseph, Der von Zedekiah geschlagene Mischa, Der von seinem Volke verfolgte, David, Der Stirbende, Simpson, or Der versenkte Jonas? They even wrote oratorios in two parts, intended for performance before and after the sermon, choosing for them any dramatic scene that took their fancy. Not that they were any less pious or less in sympathy with the church than their predecessors had been. On the contrary, they believed that this free, self-existent church music was the only true music, and that credit was due to them for having set it free from its Babylonian bondage. They aimed at creating a Protestant, that is, a subjective and dramatic art. All they really achieved, however, was the introduction into church music of the emotional, theatrical style with its orchestral painting of situations. It finally became a question whether the operatic secco recitative and the formal three-section da capo aria should not also be admitted into the music of the church. Naturally, these composers could do nothing with the choir boys whom they had at their disposal in the churches. To the choir, indeed, they attached little importance, as their music mainly consisted of solo numbers. For their arias, however, they needed accomplished singers, male and female. Until then, women had not been allowed to sing either in the Protestant or the Catholic Church, except with the rest of the congregation in the chorale. The treble and alto parts in the choruses and in the soli were taken by boys. Mattheson pours his scorn on the church choristers of that epoch who had to do duty as soloists. He describes the treble with a feeble falsetto, singing like a toothless old woman, the alto with a voice like a calf, the tenor who brays like a hoarse jackass, the bass who rumbles out the 8 feet G in the depths like a cockchafer in an empty boot, in a way that would waken a sleeping hare hardly 30 paces off, while he howls the 4 feet G like an Indian lion. Is it possible, so runs his perpetual refrain upon this question, to make music at all with the singers provided by the church? Before condemning the new church music, people should provide the composers with the performers necessary for its adequate rendering. Nor was he satisfied with mere Platonic discussion. Soon after he became cantor of the cathedral, he succeeded in introducing female singers, and in 1716 some ladies named Reichsmüller, Schwartz and Schlober made the church resound with their runs and trills to the glory of God. Mattheson plumed himself upon this achievement all his life. I was the very first, he wrote in his Generalbachschule, to employ 3 or 4 female singers in the ordinary church music before and after the sermon, though with what difficulty and vexatiousness and against what opposition cannot be described. At first I was implored not to bring any women into the choir. In the end they could not have enough of them. After the death of Telemann in 1767, the female singers seem to have disappeared again from the churches. The example of the Hamburgers had not found many imitators. We know that at Lübeck, which modelled its church music upon that of Hamburg immediately after Buxtehude's death, no female singers took place in the Abendmusiken until 1733 at the earliest. In Leipzig they never did so. The new style of church music did not triumph without a struggle. In 1726 there appeared an attack on it by a certain Joachim Meyer of Göttingen, who was both a musician and doctor juris. Mattheson made a very clever reply. He brings forward in defence of theatrical church music the same argument that Elmenhorst had used to vindicate the religious theatre. For him, too, the church art for which he is fighting is the antique tragedy transplanted into Christendom. Every religious festival, he says, is theatrical, since the biblical stories and the religious ideas they contain are represented in some way or other. The most perfect representation, however, is art. The most important and stubborn opponent of the new style was Johann Kuhnau, 1660 to 1722, Bach's predecessor at St. Thomas's, Leipzig, whose talents and capabilities were everywhere recognized, and whose famous dramatic clavier sonatas on biblical histories made it impossible to call him a reactionary. He threw himself into the fight just when the new tendency began to attract attention. When he printed his cantata texts for the ecclesiastical year 1709 to 1710, he accompanied them with a preface, in which he laid down his own ideas of the true style for church music in contrast with the theatrical style. His views did not suit the tastes of all the Leipzigers, particularly of the circle that had formed round Telemann. In his last years he had to yield to the pressure of the time and write a Passion in the new style, which was performed in 1721. After his death it was proposed to make Telemann, who was the antipodes of Kuhnau, his successor. From about 1700 all opposition to the new church music was in vain. The educated people, clerical as well as lay, had before their eyes the antique ideal of the religious drama, which Elmenhorst and Mattheson had advocated so cleverly and with such real enthusiasm. Neither they nor the musicians themselves were conscious how far poetry and music were from attaining this ideal. We, for our part, cannot place ourselves at the point of view of an epoch which revelled in the confident joy of creation, and went on its way without being crushed or made self-reflective by any great tradition either of classical dramatic poetry or classical music, but in unmoved simplicity prized its own imperfect work as being the realization of the ideal it was aiming at, and thought that all it needed to produce classical art was to pursue an antique ideal. From our standpoint we must always judge that age unjustly, for we lack the self-confident creative force that was at once its strength and its weakness. We feel ourselves to be epigones. The tribute paid by these men to antiquity, however, was merely a rhetorical one. They were convinced that with them the last great artistic epoch had arrived. Feeling themselves thus free of the jurisdiction of antiquity, they fell victims to every deception and illusion, and finally obeyed the voice that counselled them, if they would make church music wholly new, to cease taking their texts from the Bible and the old congregational hymn. The fate of the cantata was decided by the appearance of the first yearly cycle of Erdmann Neumeister's Kirchenandachten. The first cycle was composed for the court church in Weissenfels and was set to music by Philipp Krieger. 1649 to 1725, the court Kapellmeister there. Neumeister's madrigal cantatas have nothing in common with the earlier attempts at the madrigal in German religious poetry, but are imitations of the Italian opera texts, the author himself declaring in his preface that for him a cantata is only a fragment of an opera. He makes each of them consist of 4 arias and 4 recitatives. He discards altogether biblical passages and verses from the hymn books, nor are there any choruses. In the succeeding cycles he makes some concessions. The second, 1708, again gives the chorus its due. In the third, 1711, a modest place is again granted to biblical passages and hymn verses by the side of arias and recitatives. The modern cantata was henceforth cultivated in this infelicitous compromise. In 1716, Tilgener issued in one volume all the texts of Neumeister that had appeared during the 5 previous years. The composers at once seized upon them. Telemann, who at that time was not yet in Hamburg but in Eisenach, had set the third and fourth cycles to music on their first appearance in 1711 and 1714 respectively. Bach also composed music to Neumeister's texts. He knew the author personally and admired him as a genuine poet. Neumeister on his side valued Bach very highly and would gladly have had him in Hamburg. Neumeister had a rival in Salomo Frank, born in 1659, of Weimar, who was secretary to the consistory in Armstadt from 1691 to 1697, where he published his Madrigalische Seelenlust über der heilige Leben unseres Enlosers, 1697. Bach's Passions show traces of the influence of this poem. At a later date, Frank became personally acquainted with Bach when the latter was stationed at Weimar, and supplied him with some cantata texts. The poems of Frank that appeared after 1711 are influenced by Neumeister. He harks back, however, much more than the latter to the old madrigalesque religious poetry, and, if not so clever, is more profound than the man he had taken for his model. In the future it became a recognized part of the business of a poet to write cantata texts. To do so it was not necessary for him to have any personal connection with sacred poetry. He could insert a yearly cycle of texts for church pieces in the middle of some gallant or satirical publication. Thus, for a long time, the sources of a number of cantatas by Bach that are connected textually, musically, and chronologically were unknown until Philipp Spitta found them in the collected poems of Marianne von Ziegler, the contemporary Leipzig poetess. The new cantata brought with it the new Passion. The first theatrical Passion was produced in Hamburg in 1704, during the Monday and Wednesday Vespers of Holy Week. The text was written by Christian Friedrich Hunold, a writer of opera libretti, living in Hamburg from 1700 to 1706, who did not enjoy the best of reputations. In the literary world he was known by the name of Menantis. Kaiser supplied the music. The whole Passion was now represented as a dramatic action. The place of the biblical story of the Passion was taken by a versified text that connected the separate scenes. It is noteworthy that in this Passion we already have the daughter of Zion, whom we shall meet with again in Bach. The indignation was universal, not so much on account of the new departure itself as on account of the extremely wretched theatrical style. In the same year Handel also wrote a Passion to a text by Postel, another Hamburg opera poet, which was performed without winning any success. In 1712 appeared the Passion poem of the Hamburg town councillor Barthold Heinrich Brockus. In the main he retains the plan and the constituents of Kaiser's Passion. He makes use of free recitatives and da capo arias, admits the daughter of Zion, and replaces the gospel narrative by a versified recital of the Passion, keeping more closely, however, to the biblical wording than Hunold Menantis. The only real new feature was the insertion of chorale strophes. For the rest he did nothing more than discard some of the theatrical elements of Hunold's Passion, and to purge the diction of its worst impurities. And this text became the classical one for the Passion. Kaiser set it to music in 1712, Handel and Telemann in 1716, and Mattheson in 1718. The last name's Passion was performed during the service on Palm Sunday in 1718. Telemann produced his in Frankfurt. It was excellently performed, he himself tells us, in the chief church on several special weekdays, in the presence of various great people and an indescribable throng of hearers, for the good of the orphan institution. I may record the singular fact that guards were posted at the church doors, who allowed no one to enter who had not a printed copy of the Passion, and that most of the members of the ministry were at the altar in their robes of office. Moreover, this Passion has been heard in many German churches and concert halls. When Handel set Brockus's text to music, he had developed far beyond the other Hamburg composers. Later on he made use of this music in other works. We possess the work, however, only in a copy made by Bach and his wife. The manuscript comprises 60 pages. The first 23 are by Bach, the remainder by Anna Magdalena, his second wife. It is thus probable that Bach gave a performance of Handel's Passion in Leipzig. How are we to explain the enthusiasm of composers for Brockus's Passion poem? It was certainly not the distinction of its language that attracted them, for the verse is positively vulgar. The scourging is described in the following recitative. Drauf sollten die Kriegsknecht Ebene hierin und reifen ihre Wut mehr Anrufflammen. Die ganze Schar zusammen, die banden ihn an einen Stein und geißelten den zarten Rücken mit nagelwollen Stricken. After Peter's denial, there follows this aria. Heul, du Scham der Menschenkinder, Winzler wilder Sündenknecht. Tränenwasser ist zu schlecht. Weineblut verstocke Sünder. At the same time, the text had some dramatic vitality, and it was extremely rich in opportunities for musical painting. The inflated diction did not at all repel the composers, who took it to be the characteristic of a poetic sensibility that was akin to music. Compared with Hunold Menantis's Passion poem and the libretti of the Hamburg operas, the style must indeed have seemed positively pure. Literary Germany before the time of Gottsched and Lessing possessed nothing of our modern sense of verbal values. The connection with music was really pernicious to the poetry of the time, for it was being perpetually worked up into an over-exuberance of feeling, in which it aimed at drastic images and pathetic expression without any other thought than that of making its ideas as strong and flowery as possible. Not until it parted company from music and was placed on a footing of its own by Gottsched and Lessing did it find itself again. Bach, however, lived in the decadent epoch when music and poetry led each other astray, an epoch of excessive scribbling, of superficial art in which even men of real talent like Kaiser went to ruin, an epoch which seemed fated to be impotent to create anything of durable value. Whereas at other times and in other places the great artist has been only one star among others, whose light, if less brilliant than his, he nevertheless did not extinguish. Bach is surrounded by mere will-o'-the-wisps, where his epoch, and he with it, mistook for stars. Of the innumerable cantatas that were written and admired at that time, his alone have survived their own day, and even these exhibit, both in their form and in their texts, traces of the dead world from which they have come. There is no stronger testimony to the greatness of Bach than the fact that in an epoch of error, and sharing its errors, he nevertheless wrote imperishable works. We have finally, however, the sad consciousness that he was only great enough to save himself, but not his epoch as well, that he did not hurl himself against it and strive to lead it back from this stilted poetry and the empty forms of Italian recitative and the da capo aria to the true, simple, and really dramatic church music. To this clear perception, which was to a certain degree attainable by a Kuhnau, Bach never arrived. He was in fact not the beginning of a new epoch, but the end of an old one, in which the knowledge and the errors of successive centuries found expression for the last time, as if seeking salvation together by genius. Since Bach held his peace, and though inwardly opposed to his epoch, nevertheless went its way with it, it was inevitable that his works should be thrown into the general grave with those of his contemporaries, there to await their resurrection. If the talents succumb to the errors of their time, what matters? But when the men of genius are ensnared in them, centuries have to suffer for it. The very greatness of Aristotle held Greek natural philosophy back when it was already on the path that would have led it to the discoveries of Galileo and Copernicus. Bach, with an easy consciousness of his own strength, burdened himself with the Italian forms and formulas, and so retarded the progress of German music along the path that would have led it, even at that time, to an art such as Wagner was afterwards to realize in drama. End of chapter 6. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama.